In lesson 4 now, we're going to take a look at generics. Very simply, a generic in TypeScript is a way for us to create reusable types and interfaces. So if we were to compare this to actual code or actual functions, you can think of it like a function argument for our types. More often than not, you're going to be consuming code that contains generics than you are actually writing your own generics. At least that's how I've experienced it. One of the most common examples of a generic that you'll need to supply is with useState. So if we think about the actual function useState, um, anything can be in state, right? You know, we can have numbers, we can have booleans, objects of any shape, arrays containing anything. So if we go back to our example from before, and we go ahead and import useState, let's just think about, some simple stuff. So maybe we've got const active, set active. So this would be a boolean, right? And if I set that equal to false as the default value, let's hover over active and see what type it is. So it's a boolean. So let's try it again with, maybe let's just supply it with a string as a default value. Okay, that's a string, and then if we supply it with a number, it's a number. So for these types, just like with variables, useState is going to be able to infer what type of value that we're storing as a default value and what type of value that this state actually is. However, if we've got something a bit more complex, that's when we're going to need to use a generic. Let's think, for example, if we've got some sort of API call that returns, a list. So let's say API response, and then set API response. And we set that equal to an array. What is this array going to be? I don't know, let's try. So if we hover over API response, it is a never array. Now, we skipped over never in the initial video, but just to cover it briefly here, never essentially means that there will literally never be a value. So what this is saying here is this is always going to be an empty array, which is a little bit different than what we've experienced before with TypeScript inferring types, specifically when we're defining a variable where we set the value to an array. In this case, useState is putting us in a position where we need to supply that generic. So if we were to create, some interface here, interface, API, response, maybe it's just got an ID, which is a string, and it's got some username, which is a string. To supply the generic, we would put the little square brackets here. So open and closing, and I would supply my API response. Now, is that enough? We can see we get the little hover here. So argument of type never is not assignable to parameter API response. Why is that? Well, this is an object and we're supplying an array. So don't forget to put your array in there while we're defining our types. So now we've correctly typed this. This is now an array of API response. So this is something you'll commonly have to do when defining your state. Also make sure to read the documentation around any libraries you may be using, because it's most often when you're working with a third-party library that you'll need to supply a generic. Because often you'll get generic functions that require more specific typing for your use case or your application.